Harold Thompson stood at his kitchen window, his weathered hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee as the morning sun cast long shadows across his pristine garden. At 93 years old, he had settled into a comfortable routine in the suburban home he'd owned for over 5 decades. The sweet scent of his prized roses drifted through the slightly opened window, bringing a gentle smile to his lined face. Every morning, Harold followed the same schedule he'd maintained since retiring from his post-military career as a high school history teacher. He would wake at exactly 6 o'clock a.m., brew his coffee using the old percolator his late wife, Mary, had bought them in 1975, and watch the neighborhood come to life. His military discipline never left him, even after all these years. The walls of his living room told the story of a life well lived. Black and white photographs from his World War II service hung alongside colorful family portraits. His medals, carefully preserved in a glass case, caught the morning light and sparkled. The Purple Heart and Bronze Star reminded him daily of the sacrifices he and his brothers-in-arms had made on the beaches of Normandy. As Harold finished his coffee, he heard the familiar sound of his grandson Tommy's car pulling into the driveway. These Wednesday morning visits had become the highlight of his week since Mary passed away 3 years ago. Tommy, now 32 and working as a local firefighter, had his grandmother's kind eyes and his grandfather's strong sense of duty. "Morning, Grandpa," Tommy called out as he let himself in using his spare key. He carried a paper bag filled with fresh bagels from Harold's favorite deli. "Beautiful day for gardening, isn't it?" Harold's eyes lit up at the sight of his grandson. "Perfect day, son. The roses need trimming, and those tomato plants won't stake themselves." As they settled at the kitchen table, Harold noticed something different outside. A few motorcycles had parked in the empty lot next door. The lot had been vacant since the old Anderson house burned down last summer, and this was the first time he'd seen anyone using the space. "Looks like we got new neighbors," Tommy commented, following his grandfather's gaze. "Probably just passing through." Harold nodded, but something in his gut told him otherwise. After surviving D-Day and spending 40 years teaching teenagers, he had developed a keen sense for trouble brewing. Still, he pushed the thought aside and focused on his grandson's stories about life at the fire station. They spent the morning in the garden, with Harold teaching Tommy the proper way to support the growing tomato plants. Harold's gardens had won the Neighborhood Beautification Award 6 years running, and he took great pride in passing his knowledge to the younger generation. As the sun climbed higher, more motorcycles began arriving at the empty lot. The peaceful morning air was suddenly filled with the rumble of engines and loud conversations. Harold tried to ignore the disruption, but when a particularly loud rev caused him to jump and drop his gardening shears, Tommy noticed his grandfather's discomfort. "Want me to go talk to them, Grandpa?" Tommy offered, his protective instincts kicking in. Harold shook his head. "No need for that, son. Every man has a right to use public space, long as they're not breaking any laws." His voice carried the wisdom of someone who had seen enough conflict for one lifetime. Still, as the morning wore on and the motorcycle group grew larger, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet life was about to change. He had faced down German artillery and survived the longest day in military history. Whatever came next, he would handle it with the same dignity and courage that had carried him through 93 years of life. As Tommy prepared to leave for his afternoon shift at the fire station, he gave his grandfather an extra long hug. "Call me if you need anything, Grandpa, I mean it." Harold watched his grandson drive away, then turned his attention back to the growing gathering next door. The rumble of motorcycles had become a constant backdrop to what had once been peaceful days. As he walked back inside his home, Harold straightened one of his military photos, his younger self staring back in his crisp uniform. Whatever challenges these bikers might bring, he had faced worse. Much worse. Over the next 2 weeks, Harold's peaceful life transformed into a daily test of patience. The motorcycle club had made the empty lot their unofficial headquarters, and their presence grew more disruptive with each passing day. The quiet mornings he once enjoyed were now filled with the constant roar of engines and loud music that rattled his windows. One particular Thursday afternoon, as Harold tried to take his usual afternoon nap in his recliner, a thunderous motorcycle engine jolted him awake. He slowly made his way to his front porch, leaning on his wooden cane, and observed the scene before him. At least 15 motorcycles were parked in the lot, the riders gathered in small groups, laughing and drinking beer, despite it being only 2 p.m. The leader of the group, a tall man with tattoo-covered arms and a leather vest, caught Harold's attention. The other bikers called him Spike, and he seemed to take great pleasure in being as loud as possible. Every time he noticed Harold watching from his porch, Spike would rev his engine with a smirk on his face. Harold had faced enough bullies in his life to recognize one. Taking a deep breath, he decided to approach the group. His military training had taught him that sometimes the best defense was a calm, direct conversation. As he carefully made his way across his lawn, several of the bikers nudged each other and pointed. "Excuse me," Harold called out, his voice still strong despite his age. "I was hoping we could talk about the noise level. You see, I'm a light sleeper and—" "Well, look who it is, boys," Spike interrupted, walking toward Harold with exaggerated steps. "Grandpa's come to crash our party." The other bikers laughed, though some looked uncomfortable with their leader's behavior. "I'm not trying to crash anything," Harold replied calmly. "I'm just asking for a little consideration. Many of us in this neighborhood are retired, and—" "Listen, old-timer." Spike cut him off again, moving uncomfortably close to Harold. "This is public property. We can do whatever we want here. Maybe it's time for you to invest in some earplugs or a hearing aid." More forced laughter followed. Harold stood his ground, remembering times when he'd faced much worse than a bully with a motorcycle. "I served this country so people like you could have freedom," he said quietly. "But freedom comes with responsibility." "Oh, playing the veteran card, are we?" Spike mocked, circling around Harold. "Well, guess what? Times have changed, old man. Your war stories don't mean squat here." A younger biker in the back of the group stepped forward. "Come on, Spike, maybe we could." "Shut it, Mike," Spike snapped. "Nobody asked for your opinion." Harold turned to leave, recognizing that this conversation wouldn't lead anywhere productive. As he walked away, Spike revved his engine hard, the noise echoing through the neighborhood. The old veteran didn't flinch, but his heart was heavy with disappointment. That evening, Harold called Tommy to update him on the situation. His grandson was furious and wanted to come over immediately, but Harold calmed him down. "These things have a way of working themselves out, son," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. The next morning, Harold discovered his mailbox had been knocked over. Though he hadn't seen who did it, the tire marks in front of it told the story. As he worked to set it right again, he noticed Mike, the younger biker who had tried to speak up, watching him from the lot. Their eyes met briefly before Mike looked away, shame evident on his face. Later that afternoon, the noise seemed even louder than usual. Harold sat in his living room, looking at an old photograph of himself and his war buddies. They were just kids then, fighting for a better world. Now, at 93, he found himself in a different kind of battle. As another engine revved outside, Harold's gaze fell on his combat medals. A plan began forming in his mind. If these bikers wanted to play games with a World War II veteran, they were about to learn that age and wisdom could be more powerful than any motorcycle engine. The weekend arrived with dark clouds hanging over Harold's neighborhood, matching his mood perfectly. He woke up earlier than usual, disturbed by the sound of motorcycles arriving even before sunrise. As he made his morning coffee, he heard loud laughter and the crash of breaking glass from the empty lot. Harold's morning took a turn for the worse when he stepped outside to check his beloved garden. His heart nearly stopped at the sight before him. The rose bushes he had tenderly cared for over the past decade were trampled, their delicate blooms crushed into the mud. Empty beer cans littered his lawn, and tire tracks cut ugly paths through his flower beds. Mary would have cried, he whispered to himself, thinking of his late wife who had loved these gardens as much as he did. His hands trembled, not from age but from anger, as he picked up a broken garden stake. Tommy arrived moments later for his usual Wednesday visit and found his grandfather sitting quietly on the porch steps, staring at the destruction. The younger man's face turned red with rage as he surveyed the damage. "That's it, Grandpa. I'm calling the police right now," Tommy declared, pulling out his phone. "This is vandalism, plain and simple." Harold raised his hand, stopping his grandson. "Put the phone away, son." "But Grandpa, look what they did. You can't let them get away with this. You're a war hero, for heaven's sake. You deserve respect." Harold stood up slowly, his joints protesting the movement. "Being a hero isn't about demanding respect, Tommy. It's about knowing which battles to fight and how to fight them." As if to punctuate his words, Spike's motorcycle roared past the house, the leader making a show of swerving close to Harold's mailbox. Behind him, several other bikers followed, though Harold noticed Mike, the younger biker, hanging back and looking uncomfortable. Tommy started toward the group, but Harold caught his arm with surprising strength. "I fought in Normandy, son. You know what I learned there? The loudest gun isn't always the winning one. Sometimes victory comes from understanding your enemy." "These aren't Nazis, Grandpa," Tommy said, frustrated. "They're just bullies who need to be stopped." Harold nodded slowly, a familiar glint appearing in his eyes. The same look he'd had in photographs taken during the war. Yes, they're bullies. But every bully has a weakness. Every person has a story. Even them. He walked to his garage and began pulling out old boxes, ones he hadn't opened in years. Tommy watched curiously as his grandfather retrieved his old military footlocker from behind decades of accumulated belongings. "What are you planning, Grandpa?" Harold pulled out his carefully preserved military uniform, medals still pinned to the chest. Despite the years, it remained in perfect condition, protected by both the box and his memories. Next came photographs, documents, and letters from his time in service. "Sometimes, son, the best way to fight darkness is not with more darkness, but with light." Harold held up a particular photograph, one showing him with a group of young soldiers just before D-Day. "These men taught me that. We were all scared kids, trying to be brave. Those bikers out there? They're not so different." Tommy watched as his grandfather began laying out items on the dining room table. His Purple Heart, Bronze Star, old letters from fellow soldiers, and photographs from various battles. Each item told a story of sacrifice, brotherhood, and courage. "But how will this help with the bikers?" Tommy asked, still confused. Harold smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he knew something others didn't. "You know what I did after the war, besides teaching? I worked with troubled youth, helped them find their way, and do you know what I learned?" He picked up his Bronze Star, letting it catch the morning light. "Sometimes people act tough because they're lost. They need someone to show them a better path. Those bikers out there, they think they're showing strength. But real strength? Real strength is something else entirely." As he spoke, more motorcycles arrived at the lot next door. The noise level rose again, but this time Harold didn't seem bothered. Instead, he continued organizing his military memorabilia with purpose. "Tomorrow," he said firmly, "we're going to teach them what real strength looks like." The next morning, Harold woke before dawn and settled into his favorite armchair near the window. Instead of focusing on his garden as usual, he pulled out a small notebook and pen. Years of teaching had taught him the value of careful observation. From his position, he could clearly see the empty lot where the bikers gathered. As the sun rose, he began taking notes, watching the riders arrive one by one. He noticed things he hadn't before, patterns in their behavior, the way they interacted with each other, and most importantly, the patches on their leather vests. "Interesting," Harold muttered to himself, adjusting his reading glasses. Many of the bikes had American flags mounted on them, and several riders wore military-style boots. One particular detail caught his attention: a small patch on their vests reading "Veterans Supporting Veterans." Around mid-morning, Mike, the younger biker who had shown concern earlier, arrived. Harold watched as he parked his motorcycle and walked to a nearby coffee shop. Unlike the others, Mike removed his leather vest, revealing a Marine Corps t-shirt underneath. When he returned, he distributed coffee to some of the older members of the group. Harold's attention was drawn to a heated argument between Mike and Spike. Though he couldn't hear the words, the body language told him enough. Mike pointed at Harold's damaged garden, his face angry, while Spike dismissed him with a wave of his hand. Several other bikers watched the exchange, and Harold noted that some nodded in agreement with Mike. Taking out his old military binoculars, Harold could now read more of the patches on their vests. Many showed service dates from Iraq and Afghanistan. His heart softened slightly as he realized what he was seeing. These weren't just random troublemakers. They were veterans themselves, though somehow they'd lost their way. Around noon, Harold called his grandson. "Tommy, I need you to do some research for me," he said. "Find out what you can about a motorcycle group called Veterans Supporting Veterans. Something tells me there's more to this story." An hour later, Tommy called back with surprising information. The group had started 5 years ago as a legitimate veteran support organization, running charity rides and helping homeless veterans. but recent posts on their social media showed complaints about new leadership and a change in direction. Spike only took over 3 months ago, Tommy explained. Before that, they had a great reputation in the community. They even worked with the VA hospital. Harold nodded to himself, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. He spent the afternoon watching more interactions among the group. He noticed how some of the older members sat apart from Spike's crowd, how they seemed uncomfortable with the rowdy behavior. He also saw how Mike tried to clean up trash when others weren't looking. Late in the afternoon, a van pulled up to the lot. An elderly man in a wheelchair emerged, accompanied by what appeared to be his son. They approached the bikers, papers in hand. Harold adjusted his binoculars to read the sign on the van, Homeless Veterans Outreach. The elderly man spoke with several bikers, but Spike quickly interrupted, sending them away with angry gestures. Harold watched the disappointed looks on both the visitors and some bikers' faces. Mike started to follow the van but stopped when Spike called him back. That evening, Harold sat at his kitchen table, reviewing his notes. The picture was becoming clear. A once honorable organization had lost its way under poor leadership. These weren't just troublemakers, they were lost brothers in arms. He opened his military footlocker again, this time with renewed purpose. Among his war memorabilia, he found what he was looking for, an old photograph of his own motorcycle unit from 1944. They had been scouts in France, riding through dangerous territory to gather intelligence. Sometimes, Harold said to himself, the best way to reach someone is to show them who they really are. He laid out his uniform and medals on the table, then picked up his phone to call Tommy. His plan was taking shape, but he would need his grandson's help for what came next. Tomorrow wouldn't be about confrontation, it would be about resurrection, about reminding lost soldiers of their true purpose. As night fell, the sound of motorcycles faded away, but Harold stayed awake, preparing for perhaps his most important mission since the war. The morning sun had barely risen when Harold began his preparations. His hands moved slowly but deliberately as he put on his World War II uniform. Despite 9 decades of age, the wool jacket still fit, though a bit looser now. He pinned each medal with care, the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star, and others that told the story of his service. Tommy arrived early, carrying a large cardboard box filled with Harold's wartime photographs and documents. "Are you sure about this, Grandpa?" he asked, watching his grandfather adjust his collar in the mirror. "When you face German artillery, son, a few bikers don't seem so scary," Harold replied with a slight smile. His reflection showed not a frail old man, but a soldier standing tall despite his years. The rumble of motorcycles began to fill the air as the group arrived for their daily gathering. Harold watched through his window as Spike pulled in, followed by his usual crowd. Mike arrived shortly after, parking his bike at the edge of the lot. "It's time," Harold said, picking up his cane more for balance than show. Tommy grabbed the box, and together they walked toward the lot. The bikers fell silent as Harold approached, his medals gleaming in the morning sun. Even Spike stopped mid-sentence, taken aback by the unexpected sight. The old veteran's presence commanded attention, his uniform telling a story before he even spoke. Harold stopped in the middle of their gathering. Without a word, he reached into the box Tommy was holding and pulled out a large, framed photograph. It showed a young Harold standing next to his military motorcycle in France, 1944. "Thought you boys might like to see what a real motorcycle unit looks like," Harold said, his voice clear and strong. He held up the photo for all to see. 76th Reconnaissance Squadron, D-Day +3. Several bikers moved closer, their faces showing surprise and interest. Mike stepped forward first, his eyes moving between the photograph and Harold's medals. "You are a military biker?" Mike asked, his voice filled with unexpected respect. "Scout unit," Harold replied, pulling out more photos. "We rode through enemy territory, gathering intelligence, saving lives. Every mission was about protecting others, serving a purpose greater than ourselves." He laid the photographs out on a nearby picnic table. The bikers gathered around, their earlier hostility forgotten as they examined images of young soldiers with their motorcycles, frozen in time from nearly 8 decades ago. "This here," Harold said, pointing to one photo, "was taken the day we helped evacuate a French village before a German counterattack. Our bikes were the only vehicles fast enough to get through their lines." Even Spike had moved closer, though he tried to maintain his tough exterior. Harold noticed him studying the Purple Heart pinned to the uniform. Got that one in Belgium, Harold explained, touching the medal. Took enemy fire while protecting a fellow scout. Would do it again in a heartbeat. That's what being a real warrior means, protecting others, not intimidating them. He pulled out more items from the box, his original military motorcycle license, letters from French civilians thanking the scout unit for their help, and documentation of their missions. Each piece told a story of service, sacrifice, and brotherhood. I've been watching you all, Harold continued, his voice taking on the tone he'd once used in his classroom. Saw your veterans supporting veterans patches. Learned about how this group used to help other vets before it lost its way. Several older members of the group exchanged glances. Mike stood straighter, while Spike shifted uncomfortably. The men I served with, Harold said, holding up a photo of his old unit, understood that the strength of a motorcycle wasn't in its noise, but in how it could be used to help others. We rode to save lives, not to destroy gardens or disturb the peace. He turned to face Spike directly. Son, you got a choice to make. You can continue down this path, destroying what good men built before you, or you can remember what it means to serve something greater than yourself. The lot fell completely silent. Even the morning traffic seemed to fade away as Harold's words hung in the air. The old veteran stood among them, not as a complaining neighbor, but as a living reminder of what their organization was meant to be. The next move would be theirs. The silence that followed Harold's words was broken by Mike stepping forward. The young Marine veteran picked up one of the old photographs, studying it carefully before addressing the group. You know why I joined this club? Mike's voice was steady but emotional. Because we were supposed to be helping other vets, doing good in the community. Look at us now, we're just bullies terrorizing an old warrior who served at D-Day. Spike tried to maintain control of the situation. Don't get soft on me now, Mike, this is our territory. Territory? Mike interrupted, his face reddening. This isn't a war zone, Spike. This is a neighborhood. And this man, he gestured toward Harold. He fought in a real war so we could have the freedom to ride these streets. Other bikers began moving closer to Harold, drawn by the photographs spread across the picnic table. An older member named Dave, who Harold had noticed always stayed quiet during Spike's antics, picked up a photo showing Harold's unit helping French civilians. My grandfather was in France during the war, Dave said softly. He used to tell me stories about the American soldiers who liberated his village. Could have been your unit, sir. Harold nodded, pulling out another photograph. This was taken in a small town near Carentan. We had just delivered medical supplies to the locals. More veterans from the group gathered around, sharing their own stories. A Vietnam vet named Carlos showed Harold his own service photo he kept in his wallet. Two younger members who'd served in Afghanistan talked about their experiences as military drivers. Tommy watched in amazement as the tough biker facade began to crack, revealing the soldiers underneath. His grandfather stood in the middle of it all, no longer the vulnerable old man they'd been harassing, but a respected elder warrior sharing wisdom with younger generations. Sir, Mike said, addressing Harold formally, would you tell us about this medal? He pointed to the bronze star on Harold's uniform. Harold touched the medal gently. That was for a mission behind enemy lines. Our motorcycle unit got word of an Allied patrol trapped by German forces. We were the only ones who could get through. For the next hour, Harold shared stories of courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood. He spoke of young men, not much older than some of the bikers present, who gave their lives for their fellow soldiers. He described the importance of using power to protect, not intimidate. Spike stood at the edge of the group, his authority diminishing with each passing minute. More of his followers were now gathered around Harold, engrossed in the history before them. Your group here? Harold said, looking around at the bikers. It has power. The question is, what will you do with it? In my day, we used our motorcycles to save lives. From what I've learned, that's what this group used to do too. Mike straightened his shoulders. He's right. Remember last year's charity run for the Children's Hospital? The escort we provided for that fallen soldier's funeral. That's who we're supposed to be. Those were before your time, Spike, Dave added, his voice stronger now. Before you turned us into something we're not. Other members began nodding in agreement. The mood in the lot had shifted completely. Where there had been chaos and intimidation, there was now reflection and remembrance. A younger biker raised his hand tentatively, like a student in class. Sir, could you tell us more about your scout missions? Of how you used the bikes for good? Harold smiled, reminded of his teaching days. Pull up those chairs, son. It's a long story, but an important one. It starts with understanding that true strength isn't about making noise or causing fear. It's about bringing hope to those who need it most. As the group settled in to listen, Spike's face darkened. He kicked his motorcycle stand down hard and stormed off to the edge of the lot, realizing he was losing his grip on the club. Harold watched him go, then turned back to his eager audience. He knew that while he might have lost his garden temporarily, he was helping to plant different kinds of seeds today. Seeds of change in the hearts of these lost veterans who just needed to be reminded of who they really were. The next day brought a remarkable change to the empty lot. Instead of the usual roar of engines and loud music, there was the sound of earnest discussion as the motorcycle club members gathered for an emergency meeting. Spike stood alone at the edge while Mike addressed the group. We're taking a vote today, Mike announced, standing tall in his Marine Corps jacket. We need to decide who we are and what we stand for. Yesterday, Mr. Thompson reminded us of something we'd forgotten, our true purpose. Harold watched from his porch, Tommy beside him. They could see Spike pacing back and forth, his face twisted with anger as more and more hands raised in support of change. Dave, the older member whose grandfather had been in France, spoke up. I nominate Mike for new president. He remembers what this club was meant to be, veterans helping veterans. The vote was quick and decisive. Out of 30 members present, 25 voted for new leadership. Spike, along with his 4 closest followers, kicked their stands up and roared away from the lot, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the remnants of their influence. Mike's first act as president was to walk over to Harold's house. The old veteran was still sitting on his porch, watching the proceedings with quiet satisfaction. Mr. Thompson, sir, Mike said, standing at attention at the bottom of the porch steps. On behalf of veterans supporting veterans, I want to apologize for everything that's happened. We'd like to make it right. Before Harold could respond, a convoy of trucks began pulling into the lot. Club members emerged carrying garden supplies, new plants, and building materials. The transformation had already begun. We took up a collection this morning, Mike explained, grinning. Thought we'd start by fixing what we destroyed and maybe adding something new too. For the next several hours, Harold watched in amazement as the bikers worked. They cleared trash from the lot, replanted his damaged garden, and began constructing wooden benches and planters. The sound of motorcycles was replaced by the rhythm of hammers and saws. Carlos, the Vietnam veteran, turned out to be an experienced carpenter. He led a team in building a beautiful wooden archway where Harold's roses could climb. 2 younger members who worked as landscapers redesigned the garden layout, making it even better than before. By mid-afternoon, a local news van pulled up. Someone had called them about the story of transformation taking place in the neighborhood. The reporter looked skeptical at first. Bikers and gardening didn't seem like a natural fit. But as she interviewed Harold and Mike, her expression changed to one of understanding. So what made you change? She asked Mike. Mike glanced at Harold, who was teaching some younger members the proper way to plant rose bushes. Sometimes you need an old soldier to remind young soldiers what honor really means. Mr. Thompson didn't fight us with anger or call the police. He showed us something better, our own forgotten values. The club members worked until sunset, their leather vests now covered in dirt and sweat. What had once been an empty lot was transformed into the beginning of a community garden. Harold's own garden was restored, with the addition of a handmade wooden bench where he could sit and enjoy his roses. As the day drew to a close, Mike gathered everyone together. Starting tomorrow, he announced, we're returning to our original mission. The first Sunday of every month will be our Veteran Outreach Day. We'll ride to the VA hospital, visit with disabled vets, and help their families. He turned to Harold. And we'd be honored, sir, if you'd be our advisor. We could use someone with your experience to help guide us back to who we're supposed to be. Harold stood among them, leaning on his cane, his eyes bright with emotion. These weren't the same men who had terrorized his neighborhood just days ago. In their faces, he saw echoes of the young soldiers he'd known in France. Men who understood that true strength came from helping others. I'd be proud to help, Harold said simply. As the group began to disperse, Harold noticed something significant. The motorcycles leaving the lot that evening didn't roar away with unnecessary noise. Instead, they rode out quietly, respectfully, like warriors who had remembered their true purpose. The transformation wasn't just in the garden or the lot, it was in their hearts. 3 months had passed since the day Harold wore his uniform to confront the bikers. The empty lot had transformed into a thriving community garden, bursting with flowers, vegetables, and the sounds of friendly conversation. Every weekend, motorcycles still gathered there, but now for a very different purpose. On this particular Sunday morning, Harold sat on his custom-made bench, watching Mike teach a group of young veterans how to tend to the tomato plants. These weren't just any veterans. They were patients from the VA hospital, finding healing through gardening and brotherhood. "You got to support them just right," Harold called out, demonstrating with his weathered hands how to properly stake a plant. Just like in life, too much support makes them weak, too little makes them fall. The garden had become a sanctuary for veterans of all ages. Korean War veterans shared stories with Afghanistan veterans while working the soil. Vietnam vets taught Iraq War veterans the secrets of growing the perfect peppers. The sound of motorcycle engines was now accompanied by laughter and friendly conversation. Tommy pulled up in his car, smiling at the scene before him. His weekly visits had become more frequent, and he often brought other firefighters to help with the heavier garden work. Today, he carried a special surprise. "Look what I found in the attic, Grandpa," Tommy said, carefully unfolding an old military map of France. "Thought the guys might like to see it." The bikers gathered around as Harold traced their old patrol routes with his finger, sharing stories of courage and brotherhood from nearly 8 decades ago. Mike noticed that Harold's stories weren't just about battles. They were about leadership, about making tough choices, about using strength to protect rather than intimidate. A rumble of motorcycles announced the arrival of more club members. They were returning from their monthly VA hospital visit, where they'd spent the morning helping disabled veterans and their families. The riders dismounted and joined the group, their leather vests now proudly displaying a new patch, a garden rose intertwined with military dog tags. "The roses are blooming beautifully, sir," Dave said, admiring the arch he built. "Just like you said they would." Harold nodded, remembering how his garden had once been destroyed. Now it was more magnificent than ever, extending beyond his property into what had once been an empty lot. The transformation wasn't just in the plants, it was in the people tending them. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to set, the group gathered for their weekly barbecue. The picnic tables they built were filled with food brought by neighbors who had gone from being terrified of the bikers to embracing them as community guardians. Mike stood up to make an announcement. "Thanks to Mr. Thompson's guidance, we've helped 15 homeless veterans find housing this month. Our charity rides have raised enough money to support the VA's PTSD program for a year, and tomorrow we're starting a new mentorship program for young veterans." Applause filled the air, and Harold felt a warmth in his heart that had nothing to do with the evening sun. He looked around at these men and women who had become like family. Some were showing off their motorcycles to wide-eyed children, others were sharing gardening tips with neighbors. All of them had found a new purpose. "You know what the best part is, Grandpa?" Tommy asked, sitting beside Harold on his bench. "What's that, son?" "You didn't just save your garden, you helped these veterans find their way home." Harold smiled, watching as Mike taught a young veteran how to prune a rose bush with the same patience Harold had shown him months ago. The knowledge was being passed down, just as it should be. As the evening drew to a close, the bikers started their motorcycles. But instead of roaring away, they rode out in a respectful formation, each one stopping to salute Harold before leaving. The sound of their engines faded into the distance like a gentle reminder of how far they'd come. Harold remained on his bench, surrounded by the garden he loved and the new family he'd found. At 93, he fought many battles in his life, but this victory was different. He hadn't won it with weapons or force, but with wisdom, patience, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest battles are won by planting seeds of change in the hearts of others.